So this is part 2 on a video series of unanswered prayer. I encourage you to go back and see part 1. This will be part 2 of 3. I'll supply the link below for the first video in this series where we ask the question, whose fault is unanswered prayer? And in the first video, we talked about how unanswered prayer can be the fault of the person praying or maybe even the prayer itself. For this video and the next one, we are going to explore the role of God Himself as a reason for unanswered prayer. And we're going to look today at the book of Job in particular, because Job answers, or at least asks this question more than many of the other books in the Bible. But just the thought of God being responsible for unanswered prayer is kind of disconcerting. It's kind of an awkward thought. It's unsettling. It doesn't sit right because it seems out of character. You know, if God is perfectly just, then why would He heal some and not others unless there was a reason on their end? You know, why would He just arbitrarily heal somebody but not somebody else, all things else being equal? Or, you know, it challenges the idea that God is compassionate, doesn't it? I mean, why wouldn't a God of absolute compassion want to stop a young girl from being sexually abused every night? It seems like it would be in character. So it's awkward, but we're going to look at Job because I believe it is this idea of God being responsible for unanswered prayer is a core issue in the book of Job. One of the most fascinating and I think important books in the entire Bible. 30 seconds just on a kind of just to bring you up to speed about the book of Job. So Job was a rich guy, great family, upstanding guy, was not a scumbag by any means. But in the first 2 chapters of the book of Job, he loses everything. He loses everything, his money, his kids die, his health, everything is gone. So it's complete tragic. That's chapters 1 and 2 of Job. And then chapters 3 and 37, which is like the majority of the book, humongous chunk of the book, it's basically an argument between Job and his friends that come to support him. And the argument in a nutshell is this. Job is saying, this is God's fault. God is the reason for this. God is the reason for my unanswered prayers that I would be delivered from this. And basically his friends come back and saying, no, Job, it can't be God's fault because God is absolutely just. God is absolutely compassionate. It has to be your fault. So literally for like 35 chapters, they go back and forth, back and forth. And I just want to give you an idea of the kind of arguments that they lay forth, you know, going back and forth between this idea, it's God's fault. No, Job, it's your fault. And so you have Job in chapter 6, verses 8 and 10. You can see it there. Job says, oh, that I might have my request. You know, in other words, oh, that I might have my prayer answered, that God would grant my hope. I wish He would crush me. I wish He would reach out and take His hand and kill me. At least I can take comfort in this. Despite the pain, I have not denied the words of the Holy One. And so basically Job is saying here, God's not answering my prayer. I just want this to end. Kill me if you have to, but I want to be delivered from this pain and from this agony. But at least I know in my heart it's not me. You know, I've not done anything wrong, Job is saying in these verses. And you'll see he makes this argument throughout the rest of the book. But his friends are insulted by that. And so how, you know, and so they come back with an argument like this. And you can see that here in Job chapter 8. This is his buddy, Bildad is his name. And Bildad says, how long will you go on like this? Your words are a blustering wind. Does God twist justice? Does the Almighty twist what is right? You know, and then goes on later in verse 20. But look, God will not reject a person of integrity. So they reject Job's arguments and say, no. You cannot be insisting that you are right or that God is twisting justice. Absolutely, He doesn't. If you were a person of integrity, Job, God would not reject you. And so I just want to go on a little bit. Job goes again, and he's like, have I sinned? In verse 20 of chapter 7. What have I done to you? Oh, he's talking to God. Oh, watcher of humanity. Why have you made me your target? Am I a burden to you? So here he's kind of shaking his fist at God, and he's saying, God, I've done nothing to you, and yet all of this is happening to me. He's maintaining his integrity, and he's laying this at the feet of God, saying, God, this is your doing. This is you doing this. This isn't because of anything that I've done. And again, his friends continue to kind of dig their heels in. Zophar now speaks up in chapter 11. And he says, shouldn't someone answer this torrent of words? They're always going personal here. Is a person proved innocent just by talking a lot? Should I remain silent while you babble on? When you mock God, shouldn't someone make you feel ashamed? You claim my teaching is pure and I am clean in the sight of God. If only God would speak, if only he would tell you what he thinks. In other words, if God spoke up, he'd put you in your place, Job, and you're not right. And then he ends up in verse 14 saying, get rid of your sins and leave iniquity behind you. It's like, Job, deal with your sin problem. That's the issue here. It's not a God thing. And again, Job comes back in chapter 19, verse 6. He says, know that God has wronged me and drawn his net around me. And though I cry violence, I get no response. Again, unanswered prayer. I'm crying out to God. I'm not getting an answer here, and it's not my fault. Though I call for help, there is no justice. Job is laying this issue of unanswered prayer at God's feet. And again, Eliphaz, chapter 22. And again, I'm trying to give you a sense. This is the argument for like 35 chapters. If you return to the Almighty, Eliphaz says, clean up your life, you will be restored. Again, they're laying it at Job's feet. Then you will delight yourself in the Almighty and look up to God. You will pray to him and he will hear you. That's important there. Eliphaz is saying, if you deal with your sin, you'll pray and he'll hear you. So in converse, because you're not dealing with your sin, Job, God's not hearing your prayer. God's not answering your prayer. And he's saying unanswered prayer is a you problem, not a God problem. Job chapter 23. Job says, I go to the east. God is not there. I go to the west, but cannot find him. I do not see him in the north, for he is hidden. I turn to the south, but cannot find him. For I have stayed in God's paths. Again, he's maintaining his integrity. He's maintaining, that this is not a him problem. I have followed his ways and not turned aside. Unanswered prayer is not my fault, Job is saying. And then finally, the end of all these discussions, another guy pipes in, and is Elihu. And I just kind of want to give you a couple of verses what Elihu says. If they do cry out and God does not answer, here's Elihu saying, here's the reason why unanswered prayer. If you cry out and God does not answer, it is because of their pride. It is a you problem. Again, Elihu is saying, but it is wrong to say God doesn't listen, to say the Almighty isn't concerned. And so the bottom line is, the summary here, basically, of all these 35 chapters, Job is saying unanswered prayer is God's fault. Job's friends are saying, no, it's your fault. Job is saying, no, it's God's. No, it's yours. Yours, God's. It's kind of this back and forth, really, for like 35 chapters. And at this point, who is right? All we have is this dialogue, is this argument. And some people will make the argument that Job's friends are arguing right because they're the ones that say, no, you know what? God is absolutely just, compassionate, and it is out of character for God to turn away from a just or a person of integrity and their prayers. Job is saying absolutely not, because that's the case for me. So we have this idea of who is right. But then, amazingly, incredibly, in Job chapter 38, between 38 and 41, God speaks. After all of this argument for like 35 chapters, God chimes in. And he gives his 2 cents, or $10, if you will. And I just kind of want to read just a little bit of it to you right now. Job chapter 38. I'm going to read verses 1 through 5 and then 16 to 18, just to kind of give you an idea. And I'm kind of looking it up right now. Job, this is God speaking. And he says, then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. And that's chapter 38, verse 1. Who is that? Questions my wisdom with such ignorant words. Brace yourself like a man, because I have some questions for you, and you must answer them. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, if you know so much. Who determined the dimensions and stretched out its surveying line? And now let me read 16 to 18 right now, just to kind of give you a sense. Again, God says, have you journeyed to the springs of the sea or walked in the recess of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gates of the deepest darkness? Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know all of this. And really, for like 3 chapters, God just lays out Job with 68 questions, I counted, about, hey, what do you know about running the universe? What do you know about creating and maintaining and sustaining the world? Basically, you can look at these 3 chapters. Here's what God says. And basically in these 3 chapters, he says, you know what, Job, there's my perspective and there's your perspective. And you have absolutely no clue. You don't know what it's like to be God. You don't see anything beyond, 6 feet from your nose. And I see and know the whole world at the same time. That's the essence of what God is saying. That's what he says. But I think what is more telling in these 3 change chapters, it's not just what God says, but what God doesn't say. And in these 3 chapters, is after all of this blustering argument between Job and his friends, God doesn't say anything about Job's suffering. He doesn't say anything about divine justice. He doesn't say anything about unanswered prayer. There's no explanation of the rationale behind why God didn't or did answer somebody's prayers. He really does not address the argument at all, the argument that took place in the last 34 chapters, which is very interesting. But he also doesn't condemn Job for asking the questions. He puts Job in his place because he doesn't have the whole perspective. But for Job maintaining his integrity, God does not say, no, Job, you were a sinner. No, Job, this is your fault. He does not do that. He simply stays in this thin lane of, you have no idea because you are not God. So at the end of the argument, and after God chimes in, we're still not sure where God stands. Was Job at fault for unanswered prayer, or was he not? We don't know that. And if the book ended there, we still wouldn't know. But that's why one of the most underrated verses in the entire Bible, one of the most important verses in the entire Bible, is Job chapter 42, verse 7. Because in that verse, God declares the truth. God reveals his side. Who won the argument? Who was speaking the truth in that argument? Was it Job or was it Job's friends? And in Job chapter 42, verse 7, we learn a lot about unanswered prayer. We learn a lot about suffering, divine justice, and all those things. Because it says in Job chapter 42, verse 7, after the Lord had finished speaking to Job, he said to Eliphaz the Temanite, check this out. He says, I am angry with you and your 2 friends, for you have not spoken accurately about me as my servant Job has. And so God is saying, you know what? I was listening to this argument that you had for 34 chapters. Job was right. Job, who was saying, you know what? It's not my fault for this unanswered prayer. Job was right. Job, the one who shook his fist at me and saying, God, where are you? What have I done? I've done nothing wrong. Job was right. You, Eliphaz, Zophar, Bildad, Elihu, and all those folks who said, oh, God can't do it. No, it must be you. You are wrong, God said. Very interesting. So here are my 5 takeaways from the book of Job. Here are my 5 takeaways that help us come to a greater understanding of unanswered prayer. Number 1, God can be a reason for unanswered prayer. That was one of Job's main contentions, and God said, Job, you were right. Okay, that's number one. But number two, God offers no further explanation. In other words, we might get a who might be responsible for unanswered prayer. It might be God, but we do not get a why. God does not explain himself. Okay, that goes to my third point, is that God is fine, seems perfectly content with keeping that part a mystery. But not just that, he expects us to be fine with it as well. Because if you look at the end of Job, after God basically just says, Job, you have no idea what it's like to be God, Job kind of says, you know what? And you can see it. He says, I get it. I didn't know. I don't get it. And Job seems perfectly content with that answer. And it's interesting that in the presence of God, Job might not have gotten an answer to all his questions, but he got to a place of acceptance and peace. And I wonder if that could help us in our lives. We might not have all of our questions answered about why or why not or what happened or who was responsible, etc. But in the presence of God, we found some kind of peace and some kind of settledness. That's what it was for Job. So yes, God seems to be perfectly fine with keeping the mystery of unanswered prayer a secret as to the why question, and he expects us to be the same as well. Number four is perspective matters. We need to remember that we are not God. We need to remember that we are seeing such a limited path. And there's this wonderful verse in the book of Isaiah that sums it up, chapter 55, verse 8, where God says, you know what, folks, people, Job, Jim, anybody listening? My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. And so there is our perspective, which is incredibly limited, and then there's God's perspective, and that was really, in essence, his message to Job. You don't see everything, and I'm not going to tell you everything, but I will say, Job, that yes, I'm the one behind this unanswered prayer. And finally, the last one, which I think is important for us, for anybody who's suffering, is, I believe, a takeaway from the book of Job, is that God is okay with the grilling. God can handle the tough questions. God can handle the truth and the frustration and the cries out from our heart. And so I think those are the 5 takeaways again from the book of Job. I just want to repeat them. God can be, and I'm saying it, God can be an answer for a reason for unanswered prayer. He offers no explanation, though. He doesn't say why. He expects us to be fine with it. That's part number 3. Job was fine with it. Perspective matters, and God is okay with the grilling. So that is one step closer to getting some solid ground in the whole pool of mystery of unanswered prayer. Next video, I want to take it one step even more, and how we can find hope and peace in the midst of our pain and suffering and questions about unanswered prayer. Thank you for listening. Have the best day possible. Walk in peace and stay awesome.